Everyone spent the last few years convinced that winning the artificial intelligence race came down to one simple thing. Whoever built the most chips, whoever controlled the most powerful processors, whoever had the deepest bench of engineers designing silicon, that country or that company would own the future. It felt intuitive. It felt like common sense. Nvidia's stock chart alone seemed to prove it. But then South Korea did something that quietly rewrote the entire rulebook, and almost nobody outside the industry noticed how big a deal it actually was. A commitment of roughly $518 billion, mostly driven by two companies, Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, didn't just add another zero to an already absurd spending war. It exposed something the rest of the world had been ignoring. Chips were never the whole story. They were just the part everyone could see. So here's the real question this raises, and it's the question we're going to spend the next few minutes answering properly. If it's not just about chips, then what actually decides who wins the artificial intelligence race? Let's rewind for a second and understand why everyone believed the chip narrative in the first place. For years, the entire public conversation about artificial intelligence hardware revolved around graphics processing units, the specialized chips originally built for rendering video game visuals that turned out to be perfect for training massive language models. Nvidia became a household name almost overnight. Its chief executive became a celebrity. Every earnings call, every keynote, every headline reduced the story to a single sentence: whoever has the most GPUs wins. And for a while, that framing wasn't wrong, it was just incomplete. Companies raced to buy as many graphics processors as they could get their hands on. Countries began treating chip exports as a matter of national security. The United States restricted advanced semiconductor sales to certain markets specifically to slow down rival development. It genuinely looked like a straightforward arms race, measured in processing power and processing power alone. But underneath that surface story, a different kind of shortage was quietly building. And this is where things start to get interesting, because the bottleneck that eventually emerged wasn't the chip everyone was watching. It was something most casual observers had never even heard of: high bandwidth memory, known in the industry simply as HBM. This is a specialized type of memory chip that sits physically stacked next to the processor, feeding it data at extremely high speeds. Think of it this way: a graphics processor without enough high bandwidth memory is like a race car engine with a fuel line that's too narrow. You can have the most powerful engine ever built, but if fuel can't reach it fast enough, that power is wasted sitting on the shelf. As artificial intelligence models exploded in size, from millions of parameters to hundreds of billions, and now into the trillions, the demand for this specialized memory exploded right alongside them. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise people. There are only a handful of companies on the entire planet capable of manufacturing this memory at the scale artificial intelligence now requires: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron in the United States. That's essentially the whole list. Suddenly, the chip everyone had been obsessing over, the graphics processor, was only half of the equation. Nvidia could design the most brilliant processor in human history, but without enough high bandwidth memory to pair with it, that processor was just an expensive paperweight. This is the first crack in the old narrative. The race was no longer only about who could design the smartest chip. It was about who could actually produce enough of the supporting memory to keep that chip fed. Now let's connect this directly to the number that started this whole conversation. Samsung and SK Hynix, the two companies at the center of South Korea's massive investment, are not primarily chip designers in the way Nvidia is. They are memory manufacturers, which means this eye-watering figure, roughly $518 billion, largely represents an attempt to dominate the exact bottleneck that the rest of the industry didn't see coming until it was already squeezing supply chains worldwide. To be precise about what that number actually represents, because exaggeration helps nobody here, this figure corresponds to roughly 800 trillion won in combined private investment pledges from Samsung and SK Hynix, reported consistently across major financial outlets and confirmed through South Korean government statements. It is not a direct government spending line. It is primarily private corporate commitment supported by separate government incentives, including tax breaks, regulatory easing, and additional public funding measures worth tens of trillions of won on top of the private figure. So when you hear $518 billion, understand it as an industry-led expansion backed by public policy support, not a single check written by the South Korean Treasury. But even once you understand the memory story, you still haven't found the full picture, because there's a second bottleneck hiding right behind the first one. And this one is even less visible to the average person scrolling through headlines: advanced packaging. This refers to the process of physically stacking and connecting different chip components together, memory layers bonded directly onto processors using increasingly complex three-dimensional techniques. It sounds like a minor manufacturing detail. It is not. As chip designs became more sophisticated, the ability to package these components together tightly, efficiently, without introducing defects became just as critical as designing the chips themselves. Reports from across the industry describe advanced packaging capacity as one of the tightest constraints in the entire artificial intelligence supply chain, right alongside memory itself. Part of South Korea's massive investment plan includes exactly this. New memory fabrication plants, yes, but also a dedicated hub focused specifically on high-bandwidth memory and advanced packaging, located in the central region of the country. This is South Korea attempting to control not just one link in the chain, but two of the tightest links simultaneously. So now the question deepens even further. If chips need memory and memory needs advanced packaging, what happens once you actually have enough properly packaged, memory-equipped processors ready to go? You'd think that's the finish line. It is not even close, because now you need somewhere to put them, and that somewhere needs an almost unimaginable amount of electricity. This is where the story stops being about factories and starts becoming about entire power grids. Modern artificial intelligence data centers, the massive facilities that actually run these trained models and respond to your prompts in real time, are now being planned at scales exceeding 10 gigawatts. To put that number into something resembling human scale, that is roughly the electricity consumption of several million homes, concentrated into a handful of industrial facilities running continuously every single hour of every single day. South Korea's government has explicitly referenced securing power access and prioritizing electricity allocation for these facilities as part of its national artificial intelligence strategy. This isn't a footnote, this is now one of the central battlegrounds. A country can have brilliant engineers, cutting-edge chip designs, and world-class memory production, and still lose the race simply because it cannot generate or deliver enough electricity to keep the lights on inside these facilities. Suddenly, the picture looks less like a chip race and more like an industrial infrastructure war fought across factories, power plants, cooling systems, and supply chains for specialty materials most people have never heard of. And this is exactly why governments around the world stopped treating artificial intelligence as simply a commercial technology trend and started treating it as a matter of national security. Because when the deciding factor in a global technological race becomes electricity generation, manufacturing capacity, and control over critical materials, that stops being a business story. That becomes a geopolitical one. Let's take a moment to zoom out and look at how different global players are responding to this broader, more complicated version of the race. Because South Korea is not acting alone in a vacuum. It is one visible piece of a much larger board. The United States has leaned heavily into subsidizing advanced chip manufacturing domestically, while maintaining its dominant position in graphics processor design and cloud computing infrastructure through companies like Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. At the same time, it has restricted the export of its most advanced chips and manufacturing tools to certain countries, treating semiconductor access as a lever of geopolitical control rather than simply a market transaction. China has responded by pouring state-backed resources into building domestic alternatives across the entire stack: chip design, chip fabrication, and artificial intelligence model development, driven by a clear strategic goal: reducing dependence on foreign suppliers who could be cut off at any moment by policy decisions made in Washington. Taiwan remains the world's dominant foundry for advanced logic chips through TSMC, meaning a huge percentage of the world's most sophisticated processors, including many of Nvidia's, are physically manufactured there. This concentration makes Taiwan simultaneously indispensable and a significant point of geopolitical vulnerability given ongoing regional tensions. Japan is focused less on raw chip production and more on the specialized materials and manufacturing equipment that the entire industry depends on, positioning itself as an essential but less visible player in the supply chain. Europe, meanwhile, has emphasized data sovereignty, research funding, and regulatory frameworks, investing in chip manufacturing at a smaller scale compared to the United States and Asia, while trying to establish rules that shape how artificial intelligence gets deployed, rather than competing purely on raw production capacity. In South Korea, sitting at the intersection of memory production and advanced packaging, essentially bet its national industrial strategy on becoming the indispensable middle layer of this entire global stack. Not the flashiest position, not the one that gets celebrity chief executives on magazine covers, but arguably one of the most structurally powerful positions in the whole ecosystem, because everyone, absolutely everyone building large-scale artificial intelligence systems needs the memory and packaging that companies like Samsung and SK Hynix produce. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the kind of question that separates casual observers from people who actually understand where this industry is heading. If a country or a company can dominate memory and advanced packaging, two bottlenecks that every single artificial intelligence developer depends on, regardless of which chip design they prefer, does that make them more strategically powerful than the company that designs the flashiest processor? Or does raw chip design still ultimately call the shots, since without a cutting-edge processor architecture, all that memory and packaging capacity has nowhere useful to go? That tension, memory dominance versus processor dominance, might end up being one of the defining rivalries of this entire decade, and it's worth thinking about which side of that bet you'd place your money on. Let's talk about the companies caught in the middle of all of this, because their fortunes are now tied together in ways that would have seemed strange just a few years ago. Samsung and SK Hynix supply the memory that makes NVIDIA's chips useful. NVIDIA's chips power the cloud infrastructure that Microsoft, Amazon, and Google are spending unprecedented sums to build out. Those hyperscale cloud companies depend on TSMC's manufacturing capacity to actually produce the processors NVIDIA designs. And all of them, every single one, now depend on securing enough electricity and physical data center space to actually run what they've built. It's an interconnected web where no single company, no matter how dominant, can succeed entirely on its own anymore. NVIDIA can design the most brilliant chip on earth, but if Samsung and SK Hynix can't produce enough memory, and if TSMC can't manufacture enough processors, and if there isn't enough electricity to power the resulting data center, that brilliant design sits there, unrealized potential, nothing more. This interdependence is precisely why South Korea's massive bet matters so much more than a single country simply expanding its domestic industry. It represents one nation attempting to lock down control over links in a chain that the entire global artificial intelligence industry, regardless of nationality, cannot function without. Of course, none of this comes without serious risk, and it would be dishonest to present this as a guaranteed winning strategy. Industry analysts have raised legitimate concerns about overinvestment. Memory markets have historically moved in dramatic boom and bust cycles, and building this much capacity based on current demand projections carries real risk if artificial intelligence spending growth slows down even modestly in the coming years. There's also the concentration risk inherent in relying so heavily on a small handful of geographic locations: Taiwan for advanced logic manufacturing, South Korea for memory, for such critical global infrastructure. Any disruption, whether political, economic, or otherwise in either location, could send shockwaves through the entire global technology industry simultaneously. Export controls add another layer of complexity. As governments increasingly treat semiconductor technology as a national security asset rather than a purely commercial product, the risk of supply chains fragmenting along geopolitical lines grows every year. A world where different regions maintain separate, incompatible technology stacks isn't just theoretically possible anymore, it's already beginning to take shape. So let's come back to where we started, because we owe it to the original question to actually answer it clearly. Was the world wrong to think the artificial intelligence race was just about chips? Not entirely wrong. Chips still matter enormously. Processor design, manufacturing capability, and raw computing power remain absolutely essential to everything happening in this industry. Nobody is arguing that chips suddenly stopped mattering. So the next time you hear a headline reducing the artificial intelligence race down to who has the most powerful chip, remember what's actually sitting behind that simple story. Remember the memory shortages, the packaging bottlenecks, the power grids being redesigned around data centers the size of small cities, and the governments now treating all of it as a matter of national survival rather than simple business competition. If you want to actually understand where this industry is heading, and more importantly, what it might mean for the technology showing up in your own garage sooner than you think, stick around. This is exactly the kind of shift that eventually reaches every single one of us, whether we're paying attention or not. To not get caught off guard by what's coming next in this industry, join us here at Driven to Distraction.